Hello there, and welcome back to Text Appeal, where I dive into the psychology, philosophy, and science behind human beliefs and human behaviors, and I really try to figure out why we are the way we are. Now, today's episode is about something deceptively simple, morality, once again. Well, what is it? Where does it come from? And how does it connect to the political attitudes and divisions we see all around us? If you remember, I am currently developing an original manuscript with the help of Dr. Chris Cam here at Adams State University. I am making some good progress doing this, and I've been doing research about politics, morality, and all sorts of topics revolving around that. And so today I am really going to be diving into moral development, and we're going to be talking about some major groundbreaking theories in the domain of moral psychology. A few notable names that I'm going to be talking about today is Lawrence Kohlberg, Elliot Turiel, and Jonathan Haidt. So let's just get right into it. I am Travis Field-Pondo. I am very grateful that you're taking time to listen to this, and let's just jump right in. So let's start with the basic question. What is morality? Well, according to Oxford Languages, and yes, I did just Google it, morality is, quote, principles discerning right and wrong or good and bad behavior. Pretty straightforward, yes, but it doesn't quite capture the complexity of morality, of course. I am all about cognitive complexity if you listen to the previous episode. Morality is one of those concepts that can start off simple with just a definition from the Oxford Languages Dictionary, right? But it quickly becomes layered, subjective, and culturally loaded depending on who you ask. That's why today's episode is about increasing our cognitive complexity, and if you remember, that is the ability to see multiple dimensions of the same issue, especially when that issue hits as close to home as morality does for so many people, naturally. And that's really going to be a part of what I'm looking at here, right? We all have moral intuitions. We appear to be innately moral beings. Now, of course, you could look at this philosophically, scientifically, religiously, but I'm really just going to stick with the history of moral psychology and things that are relevant to my research in particular. I'm not going to get too philosophical today. Now, to build this complexity, we're going to walk through some foundational ideas in moral development, starting with one of the biggest names in the business, Lawrence Kohlberg. Now, Kohlberg believed that moral reasoning develops in stages, structured into 3 broad levels, each containing 2 distinct substages within. Now, each stage represents a more sophisticated way of thinking about right and wrong, right? So it's a developmental stage theory of morality. Let me break it down. First, there's the pre-conventional level, typical in children up to about the age of 9. Here, morality isn't really about higher ideals, right? It's about avoiding consequences and making deals with authority figures. Stage 1 is called the obedience and punishment orientation to morality. Now, the motto here is pretty simple. Children aged 9 and below are really looking to avoid punishment. Kids at this stage think something like, if I get punished, it's bad. If I don't, it's fine. For example, I won't hit my brother or my sister because I'll get spanked, right? And they learn that fairly quickly. If you do something that an authority figure doesn't like and you're punished for it, well, then you learn that is wrong because I was punished. So you see kind of the simplicity, and of course, we can't expect too much out of 9-year-olds or 6-year-olds for that matter. Okay, and next up, we have stage 2, which is still under that pre-conventional level. This is called the individualism and exchange level. Now, really, kids at this age still under 9, but, a little bit closer to 9, you could think of it. They think, what's in it for me? Morality becomes kind of transactional. You help others if it benefits you, and fairness is seen in terms of direct exchange, like, I'll do my chores because I get an allowance. So you can see how that's a little bit more complex than just avoiding punishment, but still lacks cognitive complexity. Now, at this level, morality isn't yet tied to society or larger groups. It's personal, self-focused, and pragmatic, right? Children are quite practical, oftentimes. They're not as abstract as an adult. They're not lost in thought. Now, as children grow, they typically move, according to Kohlberg, into the conventional level. This is level 2 with stages 3 and 4, and this level emerges in adolescence and often lasts into adulthood. Stage 3, people focus on good interpersonal relationship. This is kind of like the good boy, good girl stage, the way it was put. Now, the idea really is that I'll be a good person in the eyes of others. You see how we start to extend into the social realm, but morality isn't this abstract, higher, transcendental thing to people in young adolescence and even young adulthood. It's more so, I'll be a good person because others are watching. Now, of course, keep in mind that there's individual differences between people. Maybe you were a saint at age 13. I know I surely wasn't. But really, morality at this age revolves around loyalty, trust, and being seen as kind and dependable. You might think that people think at this age, I'll help my friend because that's what good friends do. And so then that's where you kind of derive your sense of right and wrong, good and bad in terms of behavior. Now, next up is stage 4, and this is maintaining the social order. The motto then shifts to respect authority, maintain order. Laws and rules are respected because they keep society functioning, right? We're getting broader in our scope in terms of society and how our individual causality affects the world in total. Someone at this stage might reason, I'll follow the rules because they keep society orderly. You see, this is more complex than the 9-year-old who was really trying to avoid punishment and, make some nice little transactions with their parents. I'll do my chores because you give me something. This is a little bit broader, a little bit more complex. And at this conventional level, the individual's morality is externalized. It is anchored to social norms, expectations, and often legal systems is where people derive their morality at this age. But then, for a smaller slice of people, there's a progression to the post-conventional level, where morality becomes tied to abstract principles and internal conscience rather than just rules. Stage 5 is known as the social contract and individual rights stage. Here, a thought from a person that's entering this stage might be utilitarian in the sense that they think morality is when human beings do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. People recognize that laws exist to protect human welfare, but they aren't absolute and they're actually subject to change. They should be questioned or reformed if they harm people's rights. You might hear reasoning like laws should promote human rights. If they don't, they should be changed. So here, you see, we're getting into more complexity, where it's actually a moral thing to somebody that's reached this stage to question laws if those laws are oppressive. Now, I don't want this to become politically polarized. Of course, it always is charged that way. But what we need to focus on here is that people at this stage are more concerned with individual rights. Morality becomes kind of abstract. The individual rights of a person comes first, and of course, laws should be obeyed. However, of course, we know plenty of revolutionary people that questioned laws that now modern people have a general consensus of being absolutely terrible. To use a quite extreme example, consider the Jim Crow era in the United States, right, where African Americans were considered to be 3/5 of a person, right? This was integrated into the law of the country, right? This was something that was enforced. This was something that was regulated. And of course, MLK stood against unjust segregation laws in the civil rights movement and, of course, people before him. And we're in as far as I could tell, a more equal, a more free society because of that revolutionary thinking, right, where individual rights come first. And then finally, some people reach, according to Kohlberg, stage 6, which is characterized as universal ethical principles. This is apparently the ultimate moral compass. This is where you're woke, enlightened. And I don't mean to say that, although I can catch my tone there, was a little bit condescending, right? Woke is a term that is quite interesting to me. I'm not quite sure what that means to be woke. It's up for debate. But the point is that people that reach this stage might think, you need to follow your conscience based on universal moral principles. They think that morality is transcendent. It's something that is outside of laws, is something that is subject to change, something that is the highest, greatest good that a human can do is become kind of a moral philosopher, right? Or a moral psychologist. And it makes sense coming from a moral psychologist, Kohlberg. I wonder how much of his own ego played into this as much as he was interested in universal ethical principles. Now, at this stage, individuals appeal to concepts like justice, equality, and dignity, even when they conflict with existing laws, similar to things I said for stage 5. I'm going to use a concept from Martin Luther King Jr. here again. You could sum up some of his ideas about when it's right to disobey an unjust law, really because it's the right thing to do, even if it costs you absolutely everything, even if it costs you your life, some might say, right? And now Kohlberg really believed that you had to move through these stages sequentially. You couldn't skip around. But importantly, moral reasoning isn't the same as moral behavior, and it's rare, very rare, for people to consistently operate at stage 6. Kohlberg pointed to historical figures like Socrates, Gandhi, and of course, Martin Luther King. Now, as groundbreaking as Kohlberg's theory was at the time, it didn't capture everything. And that's where Elliot Turiel comes into the picture. Now, Turiel proposed something called social domain theory. Instead of morality being a straight-up ladder that everyone climbs the same way, Turiel said we actually make different kinds of moral judgments depending on the situation. He split moral reasoning into 3 main domains. First up, the moral domain. These are issues where someone's rights or welfare are directly affected, like hitting someone, stealing, lying, things like that. Second, the social conventional domain. This deals with normativity, norms, customs, and other things that keep society running smoothly, like dress codes and table manners. These aren't necessarily moral wrongs, they're just ways we agree to behave in certain contexts, right? Kind of like social etiquette type stuff. And third, the personal domain, the world of personal choices that don't really impact other people, things like the hobbies you like, what food you eat, or what music you listen to. Now, Turiel's big insight was that not all rules are created equal. Breaking a rule about wearing hats indoor isn't the same as breaking a rule against hurting someone. And understanding this difference is critical when we're trying to navigate or even really just understand moral disagreements. This is where we're starting to get more complex. We see that this framework also helps explain why something that seems like a huge moral issue to you might seem totally harmless to someone else. Different people, different domains. So now we have not only the different levels or stages and layers of Kohlberg and Turiel's theory, but you start to see that we have a developmental theory and then we have a state or a domain-based theory, right? And that's important. We're starting to see, not even people that dedicated large amounts of time to understanding moral psychology could agree about everything, and sometimes they miss things. Right? They're blind to certain aspects and flaws inside their own theory. And now that's when we bring in another voice, a modern moral psychologist who is actually currently still publishing books and doing research as we speak. This man's name is Jonathan Haidt. In his book, The Righteous Mind, Haidt builds on Kohlberg and Turiel, but then takes things in a totally new direction. Haidt argues that morality isn't primarily rational at all. We don't logically figure out what's right and wrong and then feel emotions about it afterward. It's actually quite the reverse. We feel first, we intuit first, we have an emotional response to something first, and then we reason about it second. We're not little logic machines, as many rationalist philosophers might hope we are. We actually have moral intuitions, gut feelings. We feel something is good or bad, right or wrong, and then the more newly evolved parts of our brain, you might think, rushes to explain it after the fact. This is why maybe two people with wildly different political beliefs can each be absolutely convinced that they are standing on the moral high ground. Their reasoning is being driven by deeply ingrained emotional intuitions, not careful logic. Haidt doesn't discard Kohlberg or Turiel, he actually honors them, but he widens the lens. Why do different cultures, different tribes, even different political groups end up with different moral foundations altogether? It's not just about reason. It's about embodied cognition and embodied emotion. It's about evolution, perhaps. That's something that I am quite interested in myself as I proceed with this research and actually consider what kind of paths I want to go on for grad school. Evolution appeals to me quite well. Evolution explains quite a lot about human behavior. Now, one last thing, morality is also about the stories the myths and the customs that shape how we feel about the world before we even start to think about it, right? We don't determine what culture we're born into. You're born into one and you're raised by it and you're conditioned, and you're also not the author of your genetic makeup either. It's kind of a interesting thing that we get 50% of our genetics from our mother and our father, and a zygote forms, and then eventually it becomes you, and you're this intelligent, moral reasoning agent, right? With all kinds of capacities for emotion and rationality and logic and argumentation and things like that. So allow me to tie all of this together to end out this episode, and the next episode is going to be building on this. Now, modern psychology, and especially developmental psychology, recognizes that our morality emerges through the complex interaction of nature and nurture. You are not born a blank slate, but you're not rigidly stuck with what you're born with either. That would be representing an extreme nativist position, right? Nativism versus blank slate. You might want to look into that philosophical difference there if you're interested. And that really is a big deal, because when we realize other people's views are actually shaped by different developmental paths, epigenetic paths, meaning their genetics as well as their experiences, their nurture and their nature, not simply stupidity or being evil, we can move beyond outrage and toward curiosity and toward trying to understand other human beings, not simply from an empathic point of view and not simply from an pure reason, right? But something that blends both. Instead of reacting and being so politically polarized, we could start understanding a little bit more neutrally, right? Here's the big takeaway from today, really. If you want to understand why people think, feel, and vote the way they do, you have to begin by understanding the deeper layers of moral development underneath all of this before we can bridge massive divides on issues that polarize people to the point of affective polarization, right? That emotional distance and gap between out-groups and in-groups. You might ask, what moral lens is this person looking through? And maybe even, what moral lens am I looking through? I think that that's the crucial bit right there. And I will, of course, in due time, be announcing the topic that I'm going to be trying to write an original manuscript on, and it has to do with kind of an internal Socratic dialogue, developing an internal Socratic dialogue, asking yourself why and why and why and why do I think that way, and maybe where am I wrong, and maybe why am I right, and maybe how does this affect, how does a particular experience or biological disposition that I've acknowledged in myself affect the way that I approach a particular moral topic or a particular political topic. Yeah, so I think all of that is extremely important, and I'm just going to wrap up here. The next episode is going to be building on Haidt's work. I barely kind of just glossed over it today. I want to be diving into Haidt's moral theory a little bit deeper. I'm going to be appealing to some neuroscience, things like that, and I'm going to, continue trying to chip away at this topic and understanding political polarization and, maybe how I can counter it by coming up with a new theoretical model. So that's it for today. Thanks for listening and for being a part of this project and helping me build a deeper, wiser understanding of what makes human beings, human beings. It's quite stressful, but fascinating nonetheless. And I'm going to, keep on trying to figure out why we're so us versus them, why we're so polarized, and I hope that you are interested in what I have to say. Thank you, and I really appreciate you listening to this episode of Text Appeal.